The Juneau World Affairs Council, in cooperation with 360 North, presents Syria, From Struggle for Freedom to Humanitarian Crisis, with Radwan Ziadeh. Ziadeh is an author, scholar, and international policy expert with a focus on Syria. He is founder and director of the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies in Syria. He is also a co-founder and executive director of the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everyone. Very nice place and studio. Thank you for Juneau World Affairs Council for inviting me here. This is my first visit to Alaska. I know it's Syria now in the topic, the headlines everywhere, CNN, ABC, and thank you for coming because actually there's a lot of misperception, of misunderstanding of what's going on in Syria and why the U.S. involved there and what the U.S. should do there. My presentation will focus actually on what's going on in Syria in the last 3 years. It's a mix of academic backgrounds. It's as a scholar, with the same time a mix of my personal story in what's going on since my family in Syria who just actually left a year ago. Since I left Syria in 2007, I came into the United States, which much more focus on the issue of transitional justice and accountability, especially in the countries who actually witnesses mass atrocities of human rights like Latin America or in Africa. And I did some work on some of Middle Eastern countries, especially Iraq and others. And also did some this is one of the reports I did in 2007 about the enforced disappearances in Syria. Since the Ba'ath Party came into power in Syria in 1963, he ended up a period of democratic institutions in Syria. And since he ruled the country in 1963, Syria was under very strong dictatorship of the Assad dynasty. In the 80s was 3 years of fight between the Islamists and the security forces, and ended up actually of the Assad family grip on power and arrested more than 60,000. Released some of them after 10 or 20 years in prison. And there was a story of 17,000 who's actually disappeared in the 80s. Until now, none of the families knows exactly, or the relatives knows what's happened for the relatives, and the government never recognized about the cases. And I did the report about the years of fear in Syria during the Assad dictatorship. When the uprising started in March 2011 in Syria, it was a consequence of the uprising started in Tunisia in December 2010, then in Egypt, then moved into Yemen and in Libya. I call this actually as Arab Spring, or the fourth wave of 5 wave of democratization. To remember us with the 5th wave of democratization happened in South Europe, Portugal, Spain, and then in Eastern Europe, where actually started from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and ended in Romania. And now the same in the Arab Spring, actually, they started in Tunisia like the domino, because most of those countries, they share the same condition. Under very strict dictatorship, there is no freedom of express. Freedom of expression never been respected, and a huge number of political prisoners. The torture has been used, and one ruling party. This is why it was uneasy when it started in Tunisia, and the people demanded actually the fall of the regime, which this is an Arab expression for Tunisian poets. He has said that's when the people, they want something, that the world has to listen to their voice. And this is, it was the slogan has been repeated in Tunisia, in Egypt, then in Syria. We see here a picture actually with the thousands of female activists who protest against the Assad government. This is in the city of Homs. It shows actually that the number of the protesters in the first phase of the uprising in Syria, it was very peaceful demonstrations against the government. During actually my study on transitional justice, I visited many countries who actually witnesses what's going, it's the same what's happening in Syria, mass atrocities, mass human rights violations or massacres, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And that's led me to go to Bosnia, and this is actually a picture in Srebrenica in 1995, when one of the massacres happened on Serbian. They surrounded more than 8,000 from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and later on the Clinton administration and President Clinton, in commemoration of this massacre, he opened this cemetery in Sarajevo. But I never thought actually what's happened in other countries, who mass graves that will happen in my country, or even if it's happened in my hometown. And this is actually this is my cousin. We'll see in the blue shirt. It was very shocking that to see what I supposed to study in other countries to happen in my hometown, in my country. And this is even in my family. This is his name, Muhammad. This is his family, now all living in Egypt after he's been actually killed in massacres. Even that there is no cemetery because the Assad government did not allow the people to be buried in dignity, and this is, they put them in mass graves. This is the cemetery in the city. The massacre take place in my hometown in called Darraya, which is 7 kilometers of the Damascus, the capital of Syria. Darraya, is a city of population of 250,000, a quarter to million, and now only 5,000 left in the city. All of them actually in Jordan, Lebanon, or even in Turkey, like my family, my mother in Turkey, my sister in Jordan, and I have other sister in Lebanon. And this is the case of every family in Syria, because now number of victims in Syria, it's approximately, according to the UN, 200,000. And we have also 4 million refugees in neighboring countries, in Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and in Jordan. And you have, according to the UN, 6 million displaced. Then 2/3 of the nation, the population of Syria is 22 million or 23 million. 2/3 of the population neither displaced nor being refugees. What's happened before in Bosnia or in Rwanda, in the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, the scholar, they call it preventable genocide, because the UN at that time been aware that something will happen where the Hutu militias, the Hutu governments committed massacres against the Tutsis in Rwanda. It was actually, there is a warning before this genocide, which lifted more than 1 million in 100 days to be killed and slaughtered. Everyone saying that that's happened because there is no actually more data or information or even pictures. No, what's happening in Syria, it's happening in front of our eyes, because that's its consequences of what's called the digital revolution or the social media revolution. You have all the photos has been documented. We have more than 1.5 million YouTubes about all the war crimes, crimes against humanity carried out and happened in Syria. But look to the response of the international community, it wasn't much difference. This is actually after the massacre in my hometown in Darraya in August 2012, which lifted more than 732 being slaughtered by the Assad forces. The response by it was actually just an expression of the concern of what's happened there. And this is why even who committed the massacre, because they don't see any response from the international community, they don't feel ashamed of what they happened. They don't feel ashamed of what they committed against the civilians. This is why actually, though the soldiers who committed the massacre, they are celebrating in the same downtown of the city of what they did, and they actually burning some of the belongings of the victims there. And this is why, give you just a background about the city Darraya. It's participated in the early stage of the uprising. They used the red flowers in a very peaceful demonstrations against, requesting, of course, a reform, requesting the right to change their own government and the right to elect their representatives. That's one of the leaders, which called Darraya Massacre. The Washington Post called him as a little Gandhi, because he's invented the idea that we should give flour and water bottles to the army soldiers and to the security police to send a message to them that we are not in fight with you, rather than we need to build much better Syria for all of us. And this is exactly after 4 years, after 7 months, since the uprising started on March 2011 until September, more than 630 activists and peaceful activists has been killed by shooting by the security forces or under torture, like the case of teenager, 14 years old, Hamza al-Khatib, and others who's been aware in the international media. And then after 6 months, the Syrians decided to take arms to defend themselves. To defend first, in the first stage actually, to defend the peaceful demonstrations that are taking place in different cities in Syria. And this is why exactly, this is the case of one of the activists, who's actually his mother. When I went to the city in el-Zore, she put actually 2 photos of him, because he's a guitar player. With the same time, he decided to take arms to defend the city of el-Zore against the Assad forces. And this is why I call it how the gun killed the guitar. After his being a guitar player, decided to take arms to defend the city. This fighting between the armed opposition, we call the Free Syrian Army, and the Assad forces continue for almost 2 months without the help of the international community. The United States, they support politically the armed opposition, and they put sanctions on the Assad government, and they decided to give non-lethal assistance. In this such response, the Assad felt that he is in power. This is why he increased his use, the violence, and his forces against the population. This is some photos which show the city of my hometown, Darraya. This is actually my buildings. As I said, that we have 250,000, only 5,000 left in the city, because the cities became like ruins. No one can live there. And there is the point I tried to make here, that after what's happened in Bosnia in 1994 and in Rwanda in 1995, the international community started thinking of building different international system not to allow this to happen. And this is after the Holocaust, on the World War II, the theory of never again, that we should not allow this to happen again. But look what's happened in Syria, it's became often again, because we see the war crimes and crimes against humanity happened in front of us every day, and the international community was unable to take actions to prevent these war crimes and crimes against humanity. We built the International Criminal Court and in The Hague, and effective in 2007. We thought that this is a sample of international justice, for everyone can look that he can brought to justice before committing any war crimes or crimes against humanity. With the same time, the United Nations adopted the responsibility to protect, which shows this is principle shows the responsibility of the international community to prevent states, dictatorships, or dictators from committing crimes or war crimes against its own people. With the same time, also responsibility to protect, it support the weak states or the weak institutions to prevent them actually from genocide to happen, like what's happening in Rwanda. But we see in Syria that the Security Council was too much divided, was unable to take any actions to help the Syrian people in this 3 years and a half. You have the Russians and the Chinese who vetoed any resolution to condemn the Assad regime 3 times and prevent any humanitarian disaster to continue in Syria. This is why the Assad government felt that it has been empowered. They have the protection of the Russians and Chinese veto in the Security Council. With the same time, they have the support of Iran. This is why they continue, they increase the use of the air power against its own people. This is the pictures in Aleppo. Aleppo, it's the oldest city on earth, according to the UNESCO. And this is now, we'll see the old city, how it's became like ruin. Do you see, this is the oldest mosque, and this is one of the churches. This has happened, the large number of the victims, which according to the UN, 200,000, of course because of the use of the Air Force. None of the other civil wars happened in North America or Latin America or Africa. They have large number of victims like the Syrian happened. Basically because the extensive use of the Air Force, the barrel bombs. With that, actually did not recognize any civilians or any targets, because the Assad government relied on his Air Force on the Soviet Union. There is no any modernizations of the Syrian army or any update. This is why always rely on the fighter jets and the old system, which of course they cannot recognize the targets. We are not talking about this is why they don't recognize, and the number of casualties, it's really high. This is a picture I took when I visited Aleppo. You will see that the Assad government used the long missiles, with the United States consider these long missiles, the Russian system called Scud. The long range missiles, it's up to 100 kilometers. Because the dangers of such kind of missiles, which are calling mass weapon destructions, the United States provide Israel and provided Turkey, which called a Patriot system, who can challenge such kind of missiles in the air. But unfortunately, they don't provide the Syrian people, which that the Assad government decided to, according to the UN, they used 96 of these missiles against the areas that went out of the control of the Assad government. What's the Syrians, they developed the system to enable actually to challenge this one. The system, it's a Facebook page. Because this actually missiles leave from the south of Syria, and it takes 15 minutes to reach its destination in the north, in the areas controlled by the opposition or out of the control of the Assad government. In this 15 minutes, the activists actually, when they show the missiles has been launched, they put it on the Facebook as a warning. Then the people in the north, they have 15 minutes to escape. Of course, there is no luck. This is why the huge number of victims in Aleppo only killed by the use of the Scots, because there is no way to escape. They have 2 kilometers circle. With this is actually in the city of Azaz. We'll see, because the use of this Scot, they left destroyed 6 buildings. 6 buildings, total buildings, has been ruined destroyed into the ground. And this is exactly a cartoon, shows exactly the story. That's when the use of the extensive barrel bombs, the extensive of the bombing, the Air Force, and still the President Obama, he said this is a red line. You can't cross it. That means you're allowed to use everything whatsoever to kill your own people, but don't use the chemical weapons. And this is a red line. And this is, you will see that this is the Assad government crossed the red line. They used actually the chemical attacks against the civilians in eastern Ghouta, which lifted 1,400 being gassed and killed. And you will see the large number. We have more than 426 children under 14 years old. 14 years old has been actually gassed and killed. And because there is no equipment, still the area until today, we're talking now under siege. You cannot actually provide any medical aids or any medical assistance. There was an opportunity at this time. You will see actually, it's photos which all have been gassed. It was here an opportunity for the United States to take actions to end the Assad regime and to help the Syrian people and to protect the civilians. Where the United States decided, and the President Obama decided to strike the Assad government because the use of the chemical weapons. Then mysteriously, it happened a deal between the Russians and the Assad government, and the United States support the deal. That the Assad government give his chemical attack, chemical weapons, and then the United States will not strike the Assad government. It's as when you kill someone with a knife. If the criminal give you the knife, you don't punish him of what he did. Exactly, that's when the Assad government decided to give away the chemical weapons which been used against the Syrian people, and not to punish the Assad of the using of the chemical weapons. And this is why the Assad continue his courses against the Syrian people. The use of the chemical, the use of the barrel bombs, the Air Force every day, which used extensively because he felt that he's been empowered or has some immunity, protection in the Security Council. And this is the stories since actually the deal of the chemical attacks. More than 85,000 has been killed by the Air Force in different cities in Syria. Here in Douma, here is in Aleppo, where actually the Syrians, they have nothing actually, it's only their hands. They don't have any trucks, they don't have anything actually and this is from the sky, how actually the building has been destroyed by the Scud missiles or the Air Force, and the people, they have only their hands to look for their beloved one from the ruins. This baby was lucky enough. This photo actually from Reuters, and that's when became the first photo of the year, last year, because it's a lucky baby, and all his family has been killed. And of course, because of the extensive use of the Air Force, as I said, it's, this photo is actually just 3 days ago, where the Assad government decided actually to bomb one of the northern part of the cities. This is why you have at least 60,000 in one day. They need to cross the border into Turkey. And Turkey now, they host more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And they said, no more, we cannot host more. And this is why they close borders until actually they clear, and they allowed this large numbers to cross the border. This is in Jordan, of course, because Jordan also hosts more than 1 million. Lebanon, 1.5 million. With this mess being created by the Assad government, that's allowed for different organizations, among them Al-Qaeda linked group, to get inside Syria and to have their own ideology. And this is why in the media you hear about the ISIS. The ISIS is actually a translation of the long name of the organizations. I think you heard different names of the organization: ISIS, ISIL, IS. The organization called the Islamic State in Iraq and in the Levant. If you translate it in the Levant, it will be ISIL. If you translated the Islamic State in Syria, in Iraq and Syria, it will be ISIS. And now they dropped Iraq and Syria, and they call themselves Islamic State, and this is why they call it IS. But those three for one organizations. And you will see here the structure of this, the organizations, which the man who called himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and two actually half of or a dozen of his aides or assistants are Iraqi officers who trained under Saddam Hussein. These organizations actually have a very extreme ideology. They did very horrific things against the Iraqis and against the Syrian people. More than 3,000 killed by ISIS, 3,000 Syrians, civilians killed by ISIS. What's the ISIS? They used actually the mess created by the Assad government and the civil war going there, and they create their own territory, and they claim themselves as an Islamic State. Now they control actually now two of the major cities in Syria, in Raqqa and el-Zore. The United States 3 days ago, President Obama authorized to strike ISIS inside Syria, but not striking the Assad government, which actually make most of the Syrians disappointed, because should actually the ISIS, it was a product of the Assad government, because most of the Syrians who fighting with the ISIS used to be actually criminal in the Assad prisons, and the Assad cleared them to create the mess and to see that I'm not fighting and the Syrian people, I'm not killing my own people, rather than I'm fighting against the terrorists. And this is why the Syrian people being stuck by dictator Bashar al-Assad and by militias, the ISIS and other terrorist organizations. And this is what what's the former Secretary of State Clinton said exactly, that the failure to help the Syrian rebels led to the rise of the ISIS. If the United States take the actions when the Syrian people demanded an actions by the United States, we will not find ourselves in such position where the ISIS, they control 1/3 of the country of Iraq and 2 major cities in Syria. And because actually fighting the terrorists, it should be a top priority for the US, because the 9/11 and others can happen again, because the increased number of the Islamists and terrorists in the region. The only way to combat that by empowering the people there and allowing good governance and allowing good institutions to rise there. And now this is actually being today, because when the Obama administration's authorized to target ISIS and not to target the Assad government, you have in the day the Syria, in the day you have the Assad airstrikes targeting the different civilians in different cities in Syria, and in night you have the US striking the ISIS targets in Syria. And this is why the Syrian people became tired and suffered. And today they have large demonstrations in different cities in Syria. They're requesting that this airstrikes should be included the Assad government, or at least to impose the no-fly zone to prevent the Assad government from targeting the civilians. Because it cannot be that the people or population of Syria under day and night airstrikes, day by the Assad government and night by the US strikes. It should be the United States take actions against the Assad government. This is the only way to empower the Free Syrian Army and the armed opposition to be able to fight the ISIS and to fight the terrorist group. The armed opposition has been fighting against the Al-Qaeda for almost 6 months without help of the United States. This is why the only partner on the ground to be the armed opposition and the Free Syrian Army to be able to end the Assad government, who is actually targeting the civilians, and to end also the ISIS. With the same time, the United States has to help and support the political transition in Syria, because the solution is not through airstrikes. It's not just targeting and killing some individuals there and go back. The issue can come back again if there is no political future to the Syrian people. This is why my institution helped with other institutions to build what we call the Syrian Transition Roadmap. And I think that you have DVDs, a copy. You can go to the SyrianExpertHouse.org. You will see the full version of that. We put very comprehensive plan about building political institutions, democratic institutions, and reconstruction in the country, and more important, building the reconciliation among the Syrians, because the Syrians cannot live. It has to have a national reconciliation process, transitional justice process, to be able to assure about accountability and assure with the same time inclusive government, which can include everyone who's not committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, to contribute in building much better future to Syria. Thank you very much.
We have an opportunity for people to ask questions. So if you would go to the microphone, and I'm sure that we'll have a lively discussion.
Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. I've heard several interviews recently with Patrick Cockburn, who is a correspondent for The Guardian, and he's written a book called When the Jihadist Returns, and he seems pretty knowledgeable about the Middle East. And it's his view that the Syrian opposition is just not strong enough to defeat ISIS. That, you know, so I guess I would like to know your opinion on that in terms of numbers. And then recently there's been report that it's going to take 1 year to train 5,000 people in the Syrian opposition, and that doesn't seem like very many fighters, and that seems like it'll take a long time. And so just what is the ability, and then I've also heard that the Syrian opposition is very divided and doesn't, can't unify itself. So what is the prospects of the Syrian opposition being able to really form a cohesive, viable ally?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. First, we have to understand why the opposition until now, the political opposition and the armed opposition, too much divided. It's united regarding the vision, having different Syria, much better Syria for every Syrians. But in the way that it's been developed, it's, when the whole society under severe dictatorship for almost 40 years, there is no culture of sharing, culture of understanding. All leaders of the opposition has to be in prison or in exile. You can't allow actually for such meetings. My weddings in Syria in 2007, I have to get a clearance from the security for the weddings. To allow people to attend weddings, you have to get the clearance. This is why there is no ability to express your opinion. And in such environment, there is no chance for opposition to come united because there is no such culture or institution of that. When the uprising started, which popular uprising is not being initiated by the opposition or by ideological group or different groups, it's leaderless, ideologyless. It was the opposition tried to unite itself, but at the same time the violence by the Assad government continue and make everyone actually any leader who can claim himself leader in the US, how we can define a leader, that the man or the woman who will be able to deliver. But the opposition leaders in Syria have been saying that we have to stop the violence against the population. And they've been repeating that for 4 years. And they are beyond their capacity or beyond their ability to do that. And that was led actually for the opposition too much divided because the opposition, they don't control connected geographical areas. Some areas being connected by the Assad government, and even the liberated areas who controlled by the opposition still being attacked by the air forces. And the people, they cannot return to this area to control it or to govern it freely because still being attacked every day by the air forces. Ensure that all circumstances in Syria does not allow to have very united, strong opposition. And it's true that the opposition will not be able to defeat ISIS by itself if they don't get help by the international community. The opposition decided to fight ISIS by its own self because the ISIS, as I said, committed too many crimes against the Syrian people. And the opposition in January 2014 initiated actually a different campaign against the ISIS. They crushed them from Idlib, crushed them from other areas. But when the ISIS controlled 1/3 of Iraq and used actually the American weapons, the Americans' vehicles, remember yesterday the Pentagon confirmed actually they destroyed 13 Humvees. Humvees actually with the United States gave to the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army, because the ISIS they control, and they used and transferred that into Syria, which they are much better equipped than the Free Syrian Army. With the same time, the continuous airstrikes by the Assad government. It's happened many times when the armed opposition tried to crush the ISIS from one of the cities, and the Assad regime intervened actually to strike not the ISIS, but the Free Syrian Army. This is why the United States and all other Western nations decided that the Assad cannot be partner, because the Assad used to help the ISIS in their headquarters, never been attacked or never been attached. This is why I agree that the opposition itself cannot defeat ISIS, especially when they're fighting on two fronts. The Assad government from one hand and the ISIS from the other hand. It has to be helped, it has to be equipped.
And so do you think, when you said the opposition couldn't defeat, so you think other countries have to contribute soldiers, the so-called boots on the ground?
No. From the day one, actually, when we asked from the US to imply no-fly zone or no drive zone, or at least a safe zone, humanitarian zone, the US ignored all of these demands. But we have requested very clear, we don't need any troops or boots on the ground. That the Syrian people, they can do that with no help from the outside. But the problems, because as I said before, the opposition has been attacked by the Assad government and by ISIS in the same time, they have to help in building organization, to transfer those different militias in the Free Syrian Army to be a national liberation army.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. My question is, how does a group, any group, gain legitimacy after all the fighting plays out? For example, in Egypt, they had elections, and then 6 months later, the army was back in, replacing the elected government. Are there elections that occur, or are there councils that are formed? How do you gain legitimacy in a situation like in Syria, and are there other situations, for example, Bosnia, in which it worked well, Tunisia, something like that?
Legitimacy is very difficult and broad definition. But why now many people are very pessimistic of the Arab Spring? Because look to the situation in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria. Why it wasn't so easy like Eastern Europe? I mean, in Czechoslovakia, we call it the Violet Revolution, because there is no one plot has been dropped. It was very easy from communist party transition into democracy. In the Arab Spring, there is two different things. First, the institutions or the dictators in the Arab region or in the Middle East, quite different than the ones in the Eastern Europe, because they ruled through different ways of ideology, nationalism, through tribes, and strong grip of the security. This is why in Libya, as example, they don't have a national army to protect the people. Rather than they have what's called Gaddafi militias. He owned his militias not to fight the enemies or to protect the land, rather than actually to use them in such when something happened against his rule. The same thing in Syria. We don't call them a national or Syrian army like Assad. We call them Assad militias, because they don't protect the civilians rather than kill civilians. And the second factor, the regional factor. In Eastern Europe, you have what's called the European Union. It's the dream for all the nations in Eastern Europe to get into the club of Eastern Union. And the Eastern Union, before expand or include any of these nations in Eastern Europe, they put set of principles about governance, about economic reform, about rules, transparency, and in all of that. And this is why this is regional organizations allow the expansion to grow smoothly and democratically. In the Arab region, you don't have any of these regional institutions. You have what's called the Arab League, which is very weak, organizations and is not democratic, and neither control any or make any difference in the decision-making process in the region. And this is why you have each country in the Arab region have different transition. The only hope is Tunisia. Tunisia, of course, they did very well in the election, in writing constitution, because they have very strong middle class, they have very education. 25% of the population, they have Facebook accounts, which very promising middle class allowed actually that transition to go smoothly. But in Libya, Egypt, in Syria, it's different story. Then how things will end with the Arab Spring? I think this is the first time in this region you have such popular revolutions. You have now a wave of counter-revolution. That's especially the army, the special interest people, the circles who used to be in power. Now they need actually to go back in power by different ways. This is why it's need more attention by the international community and by the United States. The United States helped Europe by Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan was very ambitious and an important project to help all Europe after the World War II. But now the United States decided not to involve in the region, rather than because they have the history of the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and all of that. I think what's required now more political attention from the US administrations to be able for those nations in the Arab Spring to have smooth and democratic transition.
We have one more question.
Thank you for your presentation on the catastrophe in Syria. I guess I noticed you spoke about the role of Russia and of China in blocking UN action. I know from my vantage point, it seems as though what's happening in Syria appears to be part of a wider regional conflict. And I noticed that you didn't mention, I know in a very short talk, of course, but what seems to be a divide that's emerging in the Middle East between Sunni and Shia, and particularly the involvement or the support of the Iranian government and of Hezbollah for the Assad regime, and also the support of Saudi Arabia and of Qatar, I think, for the some of the different opposition groups in Syria. One of the questions that I think emerges particularly about Syria is that Syria being having different religious groups,
Proxy war.
That there's a proxy war going on, but also if you could comment on that, and also on what the future you would envision the future for the majority in Syria, the confessional majority, and then for minorities, the Shia, the Alawites, the Christians, and the Druze and other groups in your country. How reconciliation would work with those to protect those groups, and so they could all find a place in a new Syria.
Yeah, it's of course when the things prolonged in Syria into different fights, then every nation in the region or in the international level find its feet in the Syrian war. And that's happened in all prolonged civil war. This is why you can actually compare Syrian civil war with the Spanish civil war. You can compare Syria with actually different civil wars in Latin Americans, which include the US and Russia at that time. Every prolonged civil war, it has different layers. And now in Syria, because the country has been opened for different players, there is issues domestically did not been solved. Basically, the Alawite rule of the country. The Alawite, it's 8 to 10%, and they cannot get 99% of the army or 99% of the security forces. And thus, it cannot continue forever. It has to be solved. It was a chance for the Assad when the uprising started to see, I can lead the transition. Look to what's happening in Albania as example. The same like happened, but then decided the successor of the dictator decided to dismantle the whole regime and not to fight against the people. No, the Assad government decided the opposite, that I have to rule by force. This is why it's even everyone will understand it's cannot 5% of the population control and rule the 95%. It's simple and easy. And this is why it's when, this is one of the issues. On the regional level, the Iranian government has been the bank account of the Assad government. Like the Russians is the backing, and the Iranian is the bank account which are actually providing the Assad government. When the Assad government, because his population or the Alawite community is too small, his shortage of forces or human resources, this is why the Iranian or Hezbollah come to fight and to help. This is the way that's opened the Syrian civil war into regional civil war. On the Assad side, you have at least different 11 militias fighting with the Assad government. Not only Hezbollah, you have different Shiite militias from Iraq fighting. On the opposition side, that's the Salafist. The Salafist used actually the sectarian language by the Assad government to recruit more people. This is a war against the Sunni population and we should go and help. And the Syrian uprising is nothing to do with the Sunni and Shiite. It's more about political demands, political actually transition to rule from dictatorship into democracy. The opposition, they have Alawite figures, they have Christian. And by the way, Syria never have a history of any sectarian civil war. In 1951, was Syria the first country ever in the Middle East who gave the right to women to vote, before Sweden or many European states. In 1951, the prime minister was Faris al-Khoury. Faris al-Khoury, he's a Christian, and he's a Protestant. The majority of the Christians in Syria are Orthodox. He's minority of the minorities. Even that he became prime minister for 2 terms. Then he became Speaker of the House. That doesn't prevent him being prime minister of Syria. The majority of the population support him. But when in the Ba'ath party came into power and the Assad family came into power and ruled the country by force, that's created a sectarian tension. It should be solved by peaceful ways, but the Assad government decided actually, I rule you by force. And this has led to some sectarian tension used by the fanatic Shiite or the extremist Sunni by different factors, because actually those different militias, they feed each other. The Shiite militias and the Sunni militias, everyone actually benefits from the discourse has been around. With the same time that the Saudis is backing the Sunni and the Iranian is backing the Shiites, on the international level is different story, because you have the Assad government is the only government left who's been supported by Russia. I've been in Russia 3 times, at least to open negotiation with the Russian government. They should look to the long interest with the Syrian people rather than the short-term interest with the Assad government. But as we see the Russians, their reactions on Ukraine, they never think about the long term with their neighbors rather than actually how they respond by a violent way to keep their grim on their neighbors. And this is exactly what's happened. This is why it's true, it has regional and international and different layers, but again, the goal of the Syrian uprising was clear from the day one. It was actually for political demands, for change, for a much better democratic Syria. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That was Radwan Ziadeh speaking about Syria in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded on September 24, 2014 at 360 in Juneau, with support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman & Associates Incorporated, Core Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.